Welcome to Taking Stock. I'm Amanda Lang. Coming up on the show, a look at Canada's Indigenous economy, including creating shared economic opportunity, and a close-up on ways to match capital to Indigenous interests and investments, plus the gap in social supports and addressing long-time wrongs. That's all ahead. But first, Canada's Indigenous population is large and diverse, as well as fast-growing and relatively young. Its contribution to the total GDP is also growing. Here's a look by the numbers. In 2020, the share of the country's economy attributable to Indigenous people was $48.9 billion, a decline from 2019 thanks to the pandemic. Total output for Canada's Indigenous people was estimated at $97 billion in 2020, up 18.5% from 2012. Meanwhile, the number of jobs held by Indigenous workers rose 10.3% from 2012 to 781,145 in 2020. The total Indigenous population was 1.8 million in 2021, or 5% of the country's total. That grew 9.4% in the 5 years leading up to 2021, which was actually half the rate of growth in the 5 years before that. It is a diverse population. Just over 1 million are made up of one of the hundreds of First Nations on and off reserve. 624,220 are Métis, and Inuit peoples account for the remaining 70,545. But Canada's Indigenous population isn't as well off. In fact, in a year that Canada ranked 12th on the UN Development Index, our Indigenous population ranked 52nd in the world. That gap is evident in poverty levels. In 2021, 1 in 5 Indigenous person in Canada lives in a low-income household, and Indigenous people are more likely to live in a house that needs repair or in crowded housing, 17.1% versus 9.4% for the rest of the population. For a long time, we've been encouraged to think of the Indigenous gap as a place of potential. Closing that gap, we're told, will be good for all Canadians and the economy. But that opportunity hasn't really materialized, although we've seen progress on some basic measures for Indigenous peoples. But if we really want to close the gap, what needs to happen? Tabatha Bull is president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Tabatha, great to have you with us.
Yeah, great to have you be here. Thank you.
And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about this is, there are a couple of ways you can think about sort of this economic reconciliation. And one of them, of course, is the role the governments play, equalizing spending on Indigenous versus non-Indigenous. You obviously represent a private sector opportunity. I wanted your view of how it's going. Are we making what we can of the potential of this population?
As you said, we are definitely making progress, but I think there is a lot more work that can be done, both from private sector, corporate Canada supporting Indigenous businesses, but also from government. As you said, we're seeing corporations stand up and both look at two ways. What is their role in reconciliation? How can they support communities, Indigenous employees, and Indigenous business? And we're also seeing them stand up and say, okay, let's get more Indigenous businesses into our supply chain. As a bank or a financing organization, they're looking at ways that they can get capital into Indigenous businesses. So we have now 2,100 members in our organization. About 3 years ago, we were just under 1,000. So I think that's real progress to say Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses are coming together to find ways that we can really move prosperity forward.
And what, in your view, is the best way to continue to see growth there? And by that, I mean on both sides of the equation. So the rest, kind of corporate Canada, if you will, non-Indigenous corporate Canada, seeing the opportunity and potential and the support that's needed, but also on the Indigenous side of creating entrepreneurs and supporting them when they do exist.
Yeah, thanks. So, definitely during COVID, we saw, the growth of Indigenous businesses definitely stall, and we definitely lost some Indigenous businesses. But as Indigenous people, we are definitely persistent, and I think that's been proven over centuries. So we still continue to see some growth into e-commerce and growth into real partnerships coming together. So from an Indigenous business perspective, businesses are ready and willing to partner, to grow, to find ways for them to be able to get the certifications required, to get into specific supply chains where needed, and really be part of this grow and build back better. From corporate Canada, I think we need across the corporation to really be asking those questions. So if a policy comes to your table or your boardroom or your executive table, to really think, where's the role here for Indigenous business, and how is it supporting Indigenous economy? And also, what are we missing out on if we're not ensuring that we're including Indigenous businesses in these opportunities? And if we're looking at, big opportunities from infrastructure builds, how are we partnering with Indigenous communities, and what is the benefit? Because there are significant benefits to partnering with Indigenous communities from, reducing the risk of those projects, but also from the traditional knowledge that those communities bring forward.
Yeah, and we've seen more and more of that. Do you think that we've seen kind of a natural evolution as we've seen some policies and laws change around consultation, right? Certainly around natural resource projects. Do you expect that to kind of have a snowball effect where the benefits of it become apparent and then you see more of that kind of partnership in the future?
Yeah, and I think the other opportunity there is that ripple effect, right? So if there's a good partnership with equity ownership and that revenue can be generated and brought back into the community, then there's more opportunities for that community to partner or fully own other projects as well. And I think also we are seeing that growth, but we're still missing that access to equity, access to financing for willing partners to be able to be part of those projects. And we, along with First Nation Major Projects Coalition, who was really pushing for that in the budget, we were really hoping for some type of support, equity support, loan guarantee support, some mechanism that those Indigenous communities who are looking to partner can be equity owners in these projects. There was a mention that they will continue to think about that, but we didn't get quite what we wanted in the budget this year.
So that sounds like, just a few seconds here, but that sounds like something that governments could do that they haven't done.
Yeah, definitely. And I think because I speak about this all the time, the other thing we really need government to do is really look at Indigenous economy as how do we get to prosperity? There's a lot of talk and much needed talk about clean water and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and fulfilling the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But those are just like basic human rights. That just gets us to equitable position. And we need to be thinking about prosperity in these communities.
Such a good point, Tabatha. Great to have you with us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Tabatha Bull is President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Coming up, creating more opportunity for Indigenous peoples to invest and build capital in Canada is a win-win. We're taking a closer look at different ways to do it after this.